At 6:12 on a cold October morning in Finney County, Kansas, Caleb Mercer was bolting the side of a rusted grain trailer to a fence post. The metal had once been green. Now it was orange with rust, silver where the paint had worn away, and bent in the middle like a tired man's back. Caleb held it against 2 lengths of old oil-field pipe and tightened the bolt with a crescent wrench. Across the road, Marvin Cole watched from his tire shop pickup. Marvin was 61, had changed tires in Garden City for 31 years, and believed a fence should be made of wood, wire, or something sold by the foot. Not truck hoods, not broken cultivator teeth, not the side of a grain trailer that had died before Caleb was born. Marvin lowered his coffee. Building a tank? He called, "No!" Then what? Caleb tightened the bolt. Fence. Marvin looked past him at the empty field, then at the twisted metal. "You selling the place already?" Caleb did not answer. Behind him, 240 acres of dryland sorghum stretched toward the western horizon. The crop was short, brown around the edges, and standing in rows where the neighboring fields lay flat. The bank had already set the auction date. Most people in Finney County thought Caleb Mercer had finally lost his judgment. They were about to find out what he had been protecting. If stories of patience, family, and quiet wisdom mean something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's get back to Caleb Mercer and the fence nobody understood. The Mercer farm sat 8 miles south of Holcomb, where the Arkansas River had once wandered through the prairie before men straightened its course and decided the land ought to behave. Caleb's grandfather, Ellis Mercer, broke that ground in 1948 with a Farmel H, a borrowed moldboard plow, and $42 in his pocket. The first house was only 2 rooms. There was tar paper over one window, a wood stove that smoked when the wind came from the north, and a hand pump that froze every January. Ellis and his wife Ruth raised 3 children, 12 hogs, and enough winter wheat to keep the county elevator interested. By 1971, the farm covered 320 acres. 240 acres were dryland wheat and grain sorghum. The remaining 80 sat over a reliable portion of the Ogallala aquifer and carried an old center pivot that turned with a slow metallic groan behind. The machine shed stood 28 Black Angus cows. Caleb's father had once kept nearly 60. The farm had grown, but it had never become easy. Caleb was 58 when he built the fence. He had broad shoulders, a narrow face, and hands darkened by grease, soil, and sun. His hair had gone gray around the temples. He watched more than he spoke. People sometimes mistook that for wisdom. Sometimes it was only stubbornness. Caleb had a temper that arrived quickly and left slowly. His wife, Margaret, had left in 2016 after 26 years of marriage, taking their daughter Elise to Colorado. Nobody in town knew exactly what had ended the marriage. Caleb said he had been too busy being right. That was probably close enough. The farm had taken its share from him. And two, a late freeze ruined half the wheat crop in 2020. The dry summer of 2021 turned the pasture gray and made the cattle bawl at empty stock tanks. Wheat prices fell just as diesel climbed. Then the combine transmission failed during harvest, stopping 3 miles from the field with a hopper full of grain. Caleb borrowed $318,000 from Pine Valley Bank to keep the operation moving. The loan officer was Richard Mott, 63, silver-haired, careful with his boots, and famous for tapping a pencil against his ledger whenever someone gave him an answer he did not like. "You need production," Richard told him. "I know, not experiments." Caleb looked at the pencil. "I know that." 2. The idea for the fence had started with Ellis Mercer. Caleb found the evidence in a biscuit tin beneath a stack of seed tags, along with 3 rusty bolts, a 1958 elevator receipt, and a black and white photograph of Ellis standing beside a line of young cedar trees. The document was a Soil Conservation Service pamphlet dated 1964. Its title was Shelter Belts and Field Windbreaks for Western Kansas. The paper had gone soft at the folds. Inside were diagrams drawn in black ink. One showed rows of trees. Another showed a fence with spaces between the boards. A third showed arrows moving over a field, rising above a barrier, then settling on the other side. Ellis had circled one sentence: "A barrier that is too solid causes turbulence. A barrier with openings slows the wind more evenly." Underneath, in pencil, he had written, "Leave room for the wind to forget itself." Caleb had read those words so many times that he could see them with his eyes closed. When he was 12, Ellis took him into the west field after a dust storm. The sky was brown. The fence wires hummed. Soil skittered across the road. Like dry coffee grounds, Ellis knelt and picked up a handful of dirt. "Ground tells you what." "Happened," he said. Caleb watched the dust move over the field. Ellis squeezed the soil in his fist. "You just have to quit talking long enough to hear." That was where Caleb's idea came from. Not from a television program. Not from a business coach. Not from a man who had never touched the land. From an old pamphlet, a pencil note, and a boy who had learned to watch. The science behind the fence was plain, though the people laughing at it did not know that. Wind erosion begins when moving air reaches enough speed to lift or roll loose soil particles across the surface. Fine, dry soil is especially vulnerable after tillage has broken the ground into small, smooth particles. Bare soil gives the wind a clean runway. Crop residue breaks that runway. Standing stalks create roughness near the surface. Roots hold soil in place. A porous windbreak slows moving air without throwing it back into the field in violent, swirling currents. A solid wall may look stronger, but it can create turbulence on the downwind side. The useful barrier is partly open. Agricultural windbreak guidance commonly favors moderate density, often leaving roughly 40 to 60% open space, depending on the purpose and design. The protected area can extend several barrier heights downwind, depending on wind direction, barrier height, density, and surface conditions. Caleb's fence would stand 4 feet high. It would run for nearly 200 feet along the western edge of the dryland field, almost perpendicular to the strongest winter winds. He would leave the wheat stubble standing. He would leave gaps between the pieces of metal. He would not make it pretty. He would make it useful. The first version failed in November. Caleb had made the panels too tight. The wind struck the solid sections, climbed over them, and dropped into the field in hard, twisting currents. Dust gathered in one place and scoured the ground bare in another. After 3 days, he stopped pretending it was working. He spent 2 cold afternoons unbolting the panels. His fingers cracked from the cold. The wrench left a red mark across his palm. Marvin Cole watched from the road. "Looks like your fence is stealing the dirt," Marvin called. Caleb carried another panel. "Across the field. Too tight. Thought you knew what you were doing." "I thought so too." He loosened the gaps. The second version lasted 11 days. On the 12th, a herd of yearlings pushed through the south gate and knocked down nearly 50 feet of fence. The animals rubbed their shoulders against the metal, stepped on the pipe, and left muddy hoofprints across the wheat stubble. Caleb stood in the wreckage until the sun went down. His mother brought him a thermos of coffee. "You going to quit?" June asked. "No. Why not?" Caleb looked at the broken panels. "Because the cows didn't prove anything. The third failure came in March. Flatbed truck carrying 2 sections of scrap lost a tire on Highway 50. One panel slid into the ditch. Another bent around the axle. Caleb spent $1,740 repairing the truck and another $600 replacing the damaged metal. Richard Mott came out from Pine Valley Bank the next morning. He wore polished boots that had never been inside a feedlot. "This isn't helping your numbers," Richard said. "No, you're spending money on junk." "It isn't junk if it does a job." Richard looked down the line of metal. "What job is that?" Caleb did not explain himself. He walked to the next post and checked the bolts. Richard tapped his pencil against the ledger. "Caleb, the bank needs to see discipline." Caleb looked toward the field. The bank should look at the ground. Richard wrote something down. By April, the fence ran for 1,280 feet. It was ugly. There were red patches where old paint had faded, silver patches where the metal had been scoured clean, and black streaks of tar along the side of a truck hood. At noon, the panels flashed in the sun. At dusk, they turned the color of old pennies, but the wind moved differently there. Snow caught behind the openings instead of blowing across the road. Wheat straw gathered in narrow bands along the sheltered side. After a spring rain, the soil beneath the residue stayed dark, nearly 2 days longer than the soil in the open field. Caleb began measuring. Every Friday, he pushed a steel rod into the ground at 12 mark points. He recorded rainfall in an old coffee can. He weighed samples of soil from behind the fence and compared them with samples taken from the open field. The numbers were not dramatic. That was the point. The protected soil held more moisture. The surface stayed rougher. The wind carried less dust. Caleb did not trust one good week. He trusted a pattern. The fence did not create rain. It did not fertilize the field. It simply made the wind work harder. That was enough. Caleb planted grain sorghum in the western field and left roughly 30% of the previous crop residue standing. Some rows emerged unevenly. Grasshoppers chewed the edges. A hydraulic line burst on the planter, and Caleb spent half a Sunday replacing it in 90-degree heat. Still, the plants held. Then the summer broke. By late July, the sky over Finney County had gone pale and hard. The grass along the ditch was the color of old straw. Cattle stood under the cottonwoods, with their heads low, switching flies from their eyes. At night, the cows crowded against the north fence instead of spreading through the pasture. Caleb noticed, so did Maybelle Crane. Maybelle was 74, a retired postmaster, and the kind of woman who kept a notebook beside the kitchen window. She wrote down the first frost, the last swallow, the date the cottonwoods turned yellow, and every storm that damaged a mailbox. On August 3rd, she called Caleb. "Your cows are facing west," she said. "They face every direction. Not tonight." Caleb stepped outside. The air was still, but a brown line had formed along the western horizon. Maybelle came over the next morning in a white Buick with 182,000 miles on it. She wore a blue cardigan and carried the notebook under her arm. "I've lived here since 1968, she said. "The sky is wrong." Caleb looked toward the horizon. "Dry," he said. "Dry, wrong." The storm arrived after midnight, at 12:47. The old cottonwood behind the house snapped in half. At 1:16, the roof on the machine shed began to lift. Caleb climbed onto the roof in the dark, with a coil of rope around his waist. Margaret's old blue rain jacket still hung in the mudroom. Though she had not lived there in 7 years, he saw it as he passed. He stopped for half a second, then he went outside. The wind hit him hard enough to make him kneel. By dawn, the county was covered in dust. Fences disappeared beneath brown drifts. Wheat stubble rattled against the windows. Tin roofing moved through the air like cards thrown from a deck. The open fields west of the county road were stripped almost clean. Caleb's fence bent in 3 places. It did not fall. Behind it, the soil lay dark beneath the residue. The sorghum stalks were battered, but their roots still held the ground. The porous barrier had slowed the wind near the surface. The standing residue had protected the soil that the fence alone could not protect. The fence had not stopped the storm. It had given the field a chance. For 2 days, Caleb repaired the damage. He replaced 9 posts, rewired a gate, and straightened the side of an old combine that had folded in the middle. Nobody came to help, not out of cruelty. Everyone had damage of their own. Pine Valley. Bank sent a letter on the 3rd day. The farm was in default. Richard Mott arrived a week later with a county appraiser named Glenn Mott, his younger brother. Glenn was 56 and had appraised farm ground for 23 years. He had once told a radio interviewer that clean fields are honest fields. He stood beside Caleb's fence and rubbed his thumb over the rust. The bank doesn't lend against this. Glenn said, "It isn't the collateral. What is it?" "The ground." Glenn laughed once. "Ground is ground." "No." That was all Caleb said. Glenn looked across the field, but he did not kneel. In September, Pine Valley Bank foreclosed. The auction was scheduled for October 21st, 2023, at 10 in the morning. The notice listed Caleb's combine, 2 tractors, the center pivot, the cattle, the machine shed, and 240 acres of dryland ground. The bank expected the sale to cover the note. Richard Mott told people in town that Caleb's farm was a lesson in poor decisions. The auctioneer was Nora Bell, 51, a former county clerk with a voice that carried over machinery noise. She arrived before sunrise and parked beside the scale house. By 9 o'clock, nearly 60 people had gathered. Some came to buy equipment, some came to watch. Marvin Cole stood near the coffee trailer with his arms folded. Mabel Crane sat in her Buick and observed everything through the windshield. Caleb stood beside the auction block in a clean denim shirt. He had shaved. The first item was the combine. Bidding stopped at $19,000, far below what the bank had expected. The machine had a cracked housing and dust packed into the intake. The tractors brought less than their book value. The irrigation motor brought almost nothing. Then Nora Bell turned toward the west field. "We'll sell the dryland acreage now," she said. Richard Mott looked confident. The field behind him was brown and open. Beyond it, neighboring farms looked worse. In some places, the storm had exposed pale strips of subsoil. In others, cornstalks lay flat in tangled mats. The road ditches were filled with dirt. But Caleb's field held a different color. The sorghum was short, only 30 inches high in places, but it stood in rows. The stubble between the rows had not been buried. Along the scrap metal fence, bands of residue had gathered in soft ridges. The soil beneath them was dark. Nora walked out with a shovel. She pushed it into the ground near the fence. The blade went down 8 inches. At the edge of the field, where the wind had reached without interruption, the shovel stopped after 3. She lifted a clod from the protected ground and broke it in her palm. It held together. Nobody said anything. Glenn Mott came forward. He took the shovel from her and walked 20 yards west, away from the fence. He pushed down hard. The blade barely entered. He tried again. The field made a dry scraping sound. Marvin Cole removed his cap. "Well," he said. Richard Mott stared at the metal panels. A man named Howard Pruitt, 68, who had repaired combines in Syracuse for 40 years, stepped over the line and looked at the underside of the sorghum stalks. "Still moisture in there," he said. Caleb nodded. Howard looked toward the open fields. "Your windbreak did that?" "Part of it." "What's the other part?" "Residue, timing, luck." Howard gave him a hard look. "Don't call all of it luck." The bidding began at $650 an acre. It climbed to $900, then $100 a loan. "It's $250. Richard Mott stopped smiling. A young operator from Scott County bid $1,300. A wheat farmer from Garden City answered. Then Howard Pruitt raised his hand. He had no interest in farming the land himself. He wanted to buy it for his 2 sons, who had spent the last year searching for ground that would not blow away. The final bid was $1,640 an acre. The 240 acres sold for $393,600 with the equipment, cattle and irrigation parts. The auction brought in just over $431,000. The bank received its money, but it did not receive what it expected. Pine Valley Bank had valued the dry land at $780 an acre. Its appraisal treated the field as a worn-out asset that would require heavy tillage, replanting, and years of recovery. It treated the fence as scrap. The buyers had seen something different. They had seen soil. They had seen standing residue, intact roots, and a field that had not surrendered itself to the wind. The auction was supposed to prove Caleb had failed. Instead, it exposed the bank's mistake. Pine Valley Bank had valued machinery more carefully than soil. It had counted expected bushels, as if weather owed them a payment. It had approved loans against equipment that was already wearing out and land whose productive value depended on how it was treated. Caleb's field showed the difference. The bank had not lost everything because of one fence. It lost everything because it had stopped looking beneath the surface. Within 6 months, when Valley Bank failed, the Mercer auction did not cause the collapse. The bank had made too many risky agricultural loans, and the storm had exposed what its ledgers had hidden. 47 farms had been valued on equipment and expected yields. When the equipment broke and the yields disappeared, the collateral was mostly dust. Caleb's field was the exception. The bank had called the fence worthless. At auction, the fence helped prove what the bank had failed to see. The fence came down the following spring. Howard Pruitt paid Caleb to remove it piece by piece. Some panels became cattle gates. Some became braces for a new windbreak. The best sections went to a neighboring farm in Finney County. Nobody made a speech about it. The next season, Marvin Cole built a smaller version behind his tire shop, where the wind had been pushing gravel into the service bays. He left the gaps wider, 40% open, Marvin said when Caleb came to look. Closer to 50. Marvin adjusted one panel. Don't get proud. I'm not. You are a little. Caleb almost smiled. Maybelle Crane planted 3 rows of eastern red cheddar along the western edge of her property. Howard Pruitt began leaving more residue on his fields. Elena Ruiz, 29, a county extension technician in Garden City, used Caleb's measurements in a conservation meeting. She did not call it the Mercer method. She called it a porous wind barrier combined with residue management. That was probably wiser. By the following winter, 6 farms had built some version of the fence. One used old cattle panels. Another used discarded hay racks. A third used wooden snow fence with straw bales behind it. It just spread. The way useful things do. Caleb never became rich. He never appeared in the newspaper. He bought a used, combined from a dealer in Dodge City and paid down the remaining debt over 4 years. Elise came back from Colorado in 2025 with her husband and their little boy. She stood beside the western field, while Caleb showed her the old pamphlet from the biscuit tin. You kept this all these years, she asked. Mostly. What happened to the rest? Mouse got into one corner. She unfolded the paper carefully. At the bottom of the page, beneath Ellis's pencil note, she saw another sentence written in Caleb's handwriting. Watch what the wind leaves behind. Wendell Berry once wrote, "The care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy and, after all, our most pleasing responsibility." The literal harvest from Caleb's fence was measured in bushels, dollars, and inches of soil. But that was not the real harvest. The real harvest was learning that a field could speak before it failed. That a poor idea, examined closely, might contain a good one. That patience was not the same as standing still. It was watching, measuring, repairing, trying. Again, after the cows had knocked everything flat, the people who laughed at the fence were not foolish. They were simply looking at the metal. Caleb was looking at what happened behind it. And when the wind came, the difference was plain. Have you ever been doubted for doing something that looked foolish to everyone else, but made sense to you because you had been paying attention? Tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And if you want more true-to-life rural stories about patience, family, and the quiet wisdom hidden in plain sight, subscribe and stay with us.